Hi, Joe. I'm Kathy Bernstein, and it's Wednesday, October 13th, 2004. And as part of celebrating 350 years of Jewish life in America, the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society has undertaken a community-wide oral history project. And I'm visiting with Joe Hirschberg this morning, and it's my pleasure to do so. And Joe, you had received some questions, so you kind of know what, the kinds of things that we're interested in. But I think that what I'd like to do, because I really don't know about your early years and your parents and so on.
Okay.
So I think what I'd like to ask you is when and where you were born, your parents, a little bit about your parents, their names, where they came from. I'm not going to ask you all each time a question. So
Okay.
let's talk about where
That's
you were
fine.
born. Okay.
I was born in Chicago, January 13, 1922. It was a Friday the 13th, and I figured it's my lucky day
It sure is.
because I've been around now almost 83 years come January. My parents originated, my mother's side came from a little city, which name I don't know, near the border of Poland and Russia. Sometimes it was in Poland, sometimes it was Russia, so it was hard to keep track. She came in the early 1900s. She was about 8 years old. My father's family came from Hungary in the 1880s, and my father was born in Cairo, Illinois, on the Mississippi on the way to Chicago, where they were going to settle with other relatives.
What did your grandfather do?
My
Your father's father.
My father's father had a cartage company. They called it was a horse and wagon.
Uh-huh.
They called it a cartage company at that time. And he had a newspaper stand on Roosevelt Road in Chicago at one time.
Uh-huh. Your mother's father, what did he do for a living? Do you remember?
I'm not quite sure because he was pretty much retired. I think he had something to do with the garment industry. They used to call it the schmata industry. He had a little bit to do with that. I'm not quite sure because I was so young at the time.
Does the name Hirschberg mean anything?
I understand that in German it means Berg is mountain and Hirsch means deer. So if I had a coat of arms, I'd have
A deer on a mountain.
yeah, a mountain deer, a mountain and a deer, that's right.
Uh-huh.
And there is a city spelled exactly like our name, which we might have gotten in southeast Germany,
That's
right near the Hungarian border, and that's where my grandfather came from, was from Hungary in the 1880s.
So you wonder, they
Yeah.
might have said, where are
There
you
could
from,
have been
Hirschberg?
some connection there.
Sure.
But
That's interesting.
yeah.
Did you grow up in Chicago?
Only till the age of 8, and in 1930 we moved to Milwaukee because of the Depression. My father knew about a relative that had a newspaper stand here in Milwaukee, and since he had some background from his father's newspaper stand, figured he'd come to Milwaukee and try to get on their feet and then move back to Chicago eventually, so we came to Milwaukee. My dad did have buy a newspaper stand here in Milwaukee on 3rd and Wisconsin, where the Rice Building is now. And yes.
That was your father had that?
And my
stand?
father had that in the early 30s, and until he passed away in 1943. I grew up on that newspaper downtown, selling papers, as did my brother Eddie and Jack, who followed me later after I went into the service. So I literally grew up there until I was about 18, and I went to work.
Your father earned a living for a family with a newspaper stand.
It was very difficult.
It must have been.
It was very difficult with dealing with pennies, because the journal at that time, we'd buy wholesale at 2 cents and sell it for 3 cents, and the Sunday paper was 8 cents, and we sold it for 10 cents. So we're dealing really in pennies. It was a very difficult time to grow up in the recession, and in the Depression area.
Did your mother work, or was she a homemaker?
She was a homemaker, but when my father became ill, she went downtown to help. And I didn't know about it because I was already overseas with the 82nd Airborne, which is another story.
Which we'll talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit.
Right.
Growing up, so where did you live then when you moved to Milwaukee? Did you live near downtown? And
No, at that time, we could walk downtown. It was 2117 North 11th Street, and in 1930, and I went to Lloyd Street School then, and in 1932, we moved to 2450 North 10th Street, and we lived there until I got back from the service, from 32 to about 45.
so that's how long they lived there.
I lived
So there
there
were
in-
streetcars,
Streetcars to go downtown, and we used to walk a lot too.
a lot more than
At
now.
that time, and walk down to 3rd Street, which was a major business area.
Weren't there some vaudeville or some, was there,
There was vaudeville at the Riverside Theater quite often, and once in a while they'd have something at the old Palace Theater in Wisconsin Theater. That was rare. They had mostly movies. That was on 6th and Wisconsin.
was there a Davison movie theater?
There was a Davidson theater. They had plays on 2nd between Wisconsin and Michigan, and they had a lot of plays. And they also had, interesting enough, they had some Jewish players that came to Milwaukee that came from New York. You know.
Did you ever go to those?
Yes, yes.
Did you speak Yiddish? Was Yiddish spoken?
No, my mother did speak Yiddish. I understood a little, but I never spoke it much because, like so many people growing up in the States, we all felt we wanted to be good Americans, so we spoke English. But I'm very sorry I didn't pick up on the language, as a lot of people are, because there's so much in our backgrounds that we could learn from.
Sure. What kind of, Jewishly speaking, was yours a traditional home? Did you keep kosher? Yes?
Yes, my mother kept kosher. Interesting
What
enough,
does kosher mean then?
well, that was a separation of the dishes and not mixing meat with dairy and buying only kosher food. My mother's family were strictly Orthodox, so much so that my grandfather and grandmother were mainstays in their shul, and my grandfather had the keys to the shul. He and the rabbi, I don't know, he was something like a shamus, I guess. But in any case,
Were they
that's
here? Did they live here?
in Chicago.
Okay.
That was all in Chicago. My grandfather did come to live with us in the latter part of the 30s after my grandmother passed away, and between 3 daughters, of which my mother was one of the daughters, he lived part-time here and there. And my father's side was so reformed that my father wasn't even bar mitzvahed. They knew very little about our history. They were pretty much, what shall I say, sort of assimilated.
So, but your mother kept a kosher home?
My mother kept
that
it.
was okay?
My
Or did-
father went along with all that, yes.
What synagogue did you belong to, or didn't you?
Yes, we did. We belonged to the old Litvische Shul, which was called, and is called now, Congregation Beth Israel on Teutonia. And on the back side of the shul was a school called the Talmud Torah. And I went to Hebrew school there since I was 8 years old in the 30s, and I was bar mitzvahed there, and went to school even beyond my bar mitzvah till I was 14. I was one of the few until I decided to go help my father downtown to help him with the newspaper stand. I used to go after school with a student pass.
You enjoyed the synagogue and learning?
Yes, I like the story about the history of our people in the Bible, and because of that, eventually I joined a Zionist organization because I liked the
Which one?
discussions. It was Hashomer Atzair,
Uh-huh.
and I liked the discussions about our people and the possibility of a future homeland, which was at that time the Palestine Mandate, and I got my kid brother involved,
What was your brother's name? I forgot.
Jack, and eventually he, when he came back from the Pacific after the war, became involved with the Haganah and also was a courier for the Haganah. And eventually he decided it was time for him to make Aliyah. And he went to what is now Israel before it was a state, and is one of the founders of Kibbutz Sasa. And I hope to visit him in about 10 days.
Oh, wonderful.
We're going to be visiting him. Harriet has not been to Israel at all. This will be her first trip. And this will be my 13th trip. And somebody said it'll be your bar mitzvah trip. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
That'll be lovely.
Yeah.
That'll be very nice. I remember going to Israel with you and Becky
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
Wasn't that Ruth?
With Ruth.
Ruth.
Yeah.
Who's Becky? Isn't
Yeah.
there a Becky?
There could have been a Becky who was
No,
a
Ruth, I'm sorry,
friend of
with
ours.
Ruth, yeah.
But Ruthie and I were married
Yes.
for 47 years.
Well, let's talk about that.
Yes.
You got married to Ruth? All right,
Yes.
but wait, before we talk about
Yes.
getting married and having
Yeah.
kids and all that, so you went to Washington, I know, and you,
No, North Division.
North- oh, you
I
went
went
to
to
North
I went to Roosevelt Junior High and
Oh.
and North Division,
okay,
and I graduated in 1940.
you graduated, okay. Did you play an instrument?
Yes, I played drums all my life since I was 10. My grandfather, my father's father, gave me a miniature drum, snare drum, and I wanted to play it all the time. My mother was afraid to let me play because she thought I'd break it. But when we moved to Milwaukee, I said, and I saw it, and she was packing it away in the closet. I says, I'd like to play drums someday. And she says, well, someday you will. Well, eventually, when I was 10, I did play drums, and I was taking lessons on Saturday mornings at Roosevelt Junior High, and I played in the band all the way through and in the orchestra. In the orchestra, I played timpani, and in the band, I played snare drum all the way through Roosevelt Junior High and North Division. And when I was in the Army, they asked me also to play because they were short a few musicians, and that was before the Red Cross and the USO, because that's the only entertainment the fellas had at that time. So I think eventually, because playing with the band, they had the band attached to the headquarters in the rear echelon, so we were behind the front. Otherwise, I would have been with my 325th Glider Infantry all the time. And eventually, as I saw what happened after our outfit was involved all over Europe in all the campaigns, I lost almost all my friends in the 325th. So I feel that the drum probably saved my life. I never thought I'd ever come home.
Let's talk a little bit about the war. As long as we skip, we'll get back to your, but let's talk about, I have a very nice picture of you that you donated with a little story when we had our World War II commemoration exhibit.
Yes.
You served, were you in France? Where were you?
We started in
Well,
Casablanca.
first of all, how did you enlist?
No, Uncle Sam and the president asked me to join, so
And when was
I
that?
was drafted at the end of 1942, and got my basic training at Fort Bragg, and that's when they were organizing the 82nd Airborne. From the original 82nd Infantry Division was split in half, and the other half was called the 101st Airborne. That was our sister division. But we went overseas. I think we landed in Casablanca in May 10th, 1943, and eventually went to Algeria to get our training with Mark Clark's 5th Army, and then we were flown to Bizerti in Tunisia, and our fellows jumped in, our paratroopers jumped into Sicily after that, and we moved into Sicily and so forth, and then Salerno, and went up the boot and till Naples, and they took our 505 parachute infantry to go on the Anzio beachhead, and fortunately the German guns were up on the hill, and our regiment was wiped out. They never got off the beach to
And
get
where
up
were
the
you?
hill. I was with the original outfit, still in Naples. Because I was attached to headquarters, I was sleeping in the police administration building on the floor there. I remember during that period in Naples with Mark Clark's Fifth Army, his headquarters. We were attached with him, as I said. And then eventually we left to go to North Ireland for 2 months for training, and then to Leicester, England, outside of the airport to get ready for D-Day. And then our boys jumped into D-Day at St. Mary Glees, and I followed them in the rear echelon.
And what did you do in the rear echelon?
Oh, when the fellas were up front, the rest of us in the band had other duties, naturally. So I pulled what they called outpost guard. Some of us drove ammo trucks, some drove ration trucks, some worked with the signal corps, until the outfit pulled back and to what we call R&R, rest and rehabilitation, and then for reinforcements we had a lot of casualties, so they brought in a lot of green troops, and a band would be called out to play for them. And we played all the big band music, like from the days of Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller, and all of us loved that music, and they loved it. So we felt that we were doing some good. And every time I visited my old outfit, as we made the rounds at the different regiments, I saw what was going on, and I knew we were losing them all the time. So,
But how did you feel about being in the war?
well, I never liked the idea of the war, but we had to have it because to fight Hitler. So it was a necessary thing at that time, and all of us were very loyal about it. So we
Did you
felt we had
encounter
to.
anti-Semitism while you were in the Army?
I didn't notice.
You
I
didn't?
I didn't notice much. There were 4 or 5 Jewish boys in our band, by the way, but I never noticed it much.
All right. I'm going to go back.
Sure.
You're in high school, you graduate from North Division, and then what
Yes.
happened? You went to university, you worked, what?
Well, I did go to work as a stock boy for Bond Clothes, B-O-N-D. I went to talk to the manager there because it was down the block from my dad's newspaper stand, so I dressed up, and he didn't hardly recognize me. He says, all dressed up, you look pretty good. We'll get you started in the stock room. And from the stock room, they asked me to come upstairs to sell men's furnishings for Christmas, and they thought I did a nice job, so they kept me on in the sales, and eventually I moved up to the second floor where they had men's suits and coats and things like that. So I became a salesperson. I did go to University Extension for some additional courses, but being the oldest in the family and then coming back from the service, my dad passed away while I was gone, and being the oldest, I thought I should get started and help my mother and
Sure.
keep the family going, and the others in the family were able to continue on with school. And
So after the war, when you came back,
Yes.
when did you meet Ruth?
well, I met Ruth.
And how did you meet her?
Well, some friends recommended her. After the war, at the Old Jewish Center at 1025 North Milwaukee Street, they had a lot of dances by the Junior Hadassah, and they were fixing fellows up with girls to come to the dances. And I didn't mind going because I wanted to get back into the fabric of society, and I felt I could meet people. Even if I didn't care for the person they fixed me up with, I felt I would meet others, and eventually I heard about Ruthie. And the interesting thing was her brother Jack and I went to school together at Roosevelt Junior High in North Division, and little did I realize I'd marry his kid sister after the war.
What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Weiner.
Oh, she was Jack.
Jack Weiner's
course.
sister,
Of
and you know, he became the director of the Jewish Center eventually, and helped start Interlochen Camp about 40 years ago.
Sure.
He was in it all his life.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. We have a very nice interview with Jack a couple months before he died.
Yes.
I was happy to have it. So you and Ruthie met, and you're working, you're in the clothing store?
Well, then I came to work, but they didn't have enough woolens, so they only could let me work part-time. And I found a job with the Veterans Administration, and I worked there, helping the clerking in the records and stuff like that, until I realized that working for the government at that time didn't have much of a future for me. Only the people that were managers or heads of departments had some kind of a future. So I was looking to get into private industry. And one day after a Zionist meeting, and I kept up my contacts with the Zionist organization. Of course, we're all older.
Sure.
I saw Leo Sedlett, who was a plumbing contractor. Although he was older than I, he told me he was moving to a new location and he didn't know what to do with the showroom. He says, I don't feel like showing bathtubs and sinks. He says, I got an idea that maybe if I had appliances, I could sell some to some of my clients because I'm doing dishwashers and disposals and water heaters and stuff like that. I said, well, I wouldn't mind selling appliances. He says the Hot Point Company was looking for a franchise in that area. So I says, oh, I'd be glad to do it. So we got together, just a verbal agreement because we were friends, and I started the appliance business with him. I did the buying of the appliances, and I sold all my friends. All my customers were friends of mine.
Where was the store?
The store was on 12th and Cherry,
Okay.
and now it's
And
Expressway.
what was it called?
It was called Sedlett Plumbing and Appliance at that time, and the friends that I had that I made and met, a lot of them were from a group that we called the B'nai B'rith Memorial Lodge. I was one of the founding members, and all the boys come to see me because they were all getting started and getting married and getting settled. So they bought their ranges, refrigerators, washers, dryers, stuff like that from me. So I felt pretty lucky. And I sold it at a pretty big discount. I sold it a little over cost, maybe 10% over cost. So I was the lowest price probably in the city, but I didn't care about making much money on my friends because I just wanted to help. And whatever I made, I was satisfied at that time.
So you and Ruth got married?
And after Ruth and I married and had 3 daughters, I decided that wasn't good enough to raise a family because I wanted my 3 daughters to go on to college because I couldn't afford to go on. And I decided to make a change and bought Jean Atlas's store on 23rd and Fond du Lac. She was a friend of mine and her
Jeanette
husband.
Atlas?
Jeanette Atlas.
She's coming, yeah, that's interesting.
And Alex Atlas. The Atlases lived a couple doors away from me, and I went through school with their brother Sid, who also graduated with me. So
What kind of store did they have?
they had mostly furniture, carpeting, and drapery. And I used to help them out with appliances because we were friends since we were kids. And then she says, I'm sort of tired of this. I'm ready to make a change. So she says, would you like to buy it? So I said, okay. So I went to the bank and borrowed the money to buy the store. And that's how I did that in 1958. And we had the store at that time until the mid-60s when I sold also carpeting and drapery and furniture to friends of mine. My friends were always good to me, but I gave them pretty good deals, so we carried quality stuff, and I gave them good service. Many times if they had a service call, I would call Ruthie and say, I'm going to be late for supper because I'm going to stop and see so-and-so on the way home. And I never charged for a service call. I felt it was good business to do that.
So after, and then after you, and just, we're going to say a few more things about your work because I want to talk about your philanthropy. Till the mid-60s.
Yes,
And then what?
and then I decided it was time for me to buy a duplex and get started in real estate because I understood, and talking to other friends of mine, I literally was educated out on the street talking to my friends, and I found out that well-to-do people own real estate and own stock, and I didn't know anything about that. So I went to real estate school and I learned a little bit about real estate, but again, I had to learn it literally working at it, because you only get the academic stuff, you know, you read the book and all that sort of thing. So I decided to get involved, and I went to work for the old Walter Kasuba company, because I thought someday I'd like to own a little apartment building for part of my retirement, because I always worked for myself and I never had a annuity or retirement plan. I just didn't have enough money for that, so I thought someday if I had a little apartment, it might be good. So that's when I went to work for him, and eventually, of course, I sold apartments, 4s and 8s and larger ones, and I decided in the process to buy some buildings that nobody wanted. And I figured maybe we could fix them up and do the necessary painting and so forth. And as a matter of fact, I still own a couple of. My dream did come true because they were my retirement.
Well, you then went into real estate full-time.
Yes, I went into real estate full-time. I told Ruthie that I had to make that change, and she agreed with me.
Did she work at the time?
No, she helped a little bit at the store, but she was raising the 3 girls. So she was pretty busy with that. But I told her it was time to make a change, to earn more money, so I went into real estate full-time.
I want to ask you a question, Joe, about you're one of the most philanthropic people I know. And
Thank you for the compliment.
well, it's the truth. It might be a compliment, but it's the truth. Where did you learn that? Where did you learn this? Who was a role model for you?
Well, I had an uncle in Chicago. My father's youngest brother was very good-natured. The fact is, they all were, but they never had much money. But I remember he was in insurance and real estate. And when I came home from the Army, I still had my uniform on. I went back to Chicago to visit. I always felt very family conscious. So every year I always went back to visit my uncles and aunts and my cousins. And I remember when I came that day, he said, you know what, it's kind of nice that you're here. I'm going to close the office. I guess he wasn't that busy. And he took everybody out to lunch downtown. And there was an office girl and another salesman and so forth and so on. And I think, and just listening to my father, my mother, because they tried to do what they could. So it sort of was in the family. They always tried to do whatever they could, even though they couldn't afford much coming through the Depression.
Right.
So I felt as I grew up that someday I want to be a volunteer, and I decided to volunteer, and the Zionist organization I wanted to help. I was back from the service. So I guess Mel Zarrett reminded me that 1947, that I was vice chairman of the junior division, and by golly, your husband, Elliot Bernstein, was chairman of the junior division.
I know, isn't it? He enjoys that memory.
Yeah, we go back a long ways. That's why I got started.
Well, so you got started in the Federation in '47.
Yes.
I know from having worked with you in campaign that you are a fabulous fundraiser.
Well, I try.
But I understand why now, and I never understood it before. First of all, you're generous, and you're kind, and you're a good salesman, because if you were selling. And that's what we do when we, in campaign, we have to sell our cause, and you do it so beautifully.
Well, I feel you got to tell the truth, and you got to be nice to people. And I thought by doing that, maybe we could accomplish some of the goals and some of the things that are important to us. Jewish National Fund, the same thing. I belonged to them for 60-some years. And ever since I was a kid, I made my first solicitation for Jewish National Fund when I belonged to Shomer in 1939. I remember I went downtown to the old Schrader Hotel, which is now the Hilton, and I solicited Fanny Pittleman, who's Merrill Pittleman's mother. She was the president of Pioneer Women at that time, and I went down there with one of the kids to solicit, and others. We heard about this organization had a meeting. We thought it was a good idea to solicit. So we got nickels and dimes in one of the containers in the pushkas, and of course they were for buying and planting trees in Israel. Eventually became Israel at that time. It was just a so-called Palestinian mandate with the British. But in 48 became a state.
Yes, it did. So together with JNF, which you're still involved in, and you're
Yeah.
still involved at the Federation.
Oh, yes.
What other agencies and what synagogue? You belong to Bethel.
Oh, yes. Eventually, we joined Bethel because it was one of the few synagogues that was teaching Hebrew school during the week. The others had Sunday schools. And talking it over with Ruthie, we decided we want our kids to have a more than a little education. We want to have a more thorough education. So we found out that at Bethel they had regular school on Monday to Thursday from 4 to 6 or 6 to 8, and then on Sundays. And so we joined them, and eventually, we started the girls, then eventually joined. We felt that it would be the proper thing is to join the synagogue if we're going to give them an education. So we did, and the girls grew up there, were bat mitzvahed and confirmed, and Bunny and Debbie were married there, and Amy would have been married there, except she was married in Israel to her Israeli
Does she live
husband.
there still?
She lived there for some years, but when her husband Eli finished the Hebrew University, which he worked his way through, Israel was going through some terrible depression times, and he had trouble getting a job. So we mentioned if they wanted to come here for a while, and and part of it was their idea to come back for a while and try to earn some money and then go back eventually. But they stayed on from 2 years to 5 years to 10 years, and they're here.
Where are they in Milwaukee?
They're still in Milwaukee and have their family consists of twin girls.
Oh.
Yeah.
How many grandchildren do you have?
So with the twin girls that Amy has, Bunny is married to Joel Honigman, and they have 3 children. And Debbie's married to my Russian son-in-law. They have a daughter and a son. So altogether I have 7 grandchildren.
Nice. Very nice. So you were introduced to fundraising at JNF, and I know you raised a lot of money at Bethel and at Bonds.
Worked with Israel Bonds. I was chairman of the Israel Bond Committee at Bethel. Israel Bonds honored me at Bethel at a dinner in 1980.
That's nice.
Yeah, I thought that was very nice.
Well, I know that as far as your work at the Federation, you've been a worker. You were the Worker of the Year in 1987, and you've been on the board of the Milwaukee Jewish Day School as well. I know that.
Oh, yes. Phil Rubenstein
and
asked me to.
Federation, of course.
Yes. Phil Rubenstein knew I was interested in our Jewish education because I made the first contribution to the campus that we have on Santa Monica at a organizational meeting when they when Phil
you were the first
when
donor?
Phil said this is a good time to buy the campus. He mentioned the Federation, and we decided to implement it. And he gave the story about it, and the room was very quiet at the time. And I thought I had to get it going because we had to raise the funds. So I volunteered to make the first contribution, and I decided to make it in honor of the day school. And Doris Schneidman was close by. She almost fell off her chair.
Can I ask you how much that
It was $25,000, and they said I could pay it off in 5 years because I didn't have the 25.
In your pocket? You didn't have it in your pocket, huh?
No, but I thought in 5 years I could pay it off. So she came to sit with me, and eventually Phil said, you know what, I know you're interested in Jewish education. Will you be on the executive committee with me at the day school? And I did. I joined Phil there. We were friends, of course, from the Federation.
Man.
Terrific guy.
Nice man.
Of course, he was a great
Well, we have
community
a
person.
beautiful film with you on it, with your grandchildren
Oh,
that we used, and I've used it many times from Walnut
Yes.
Street. It's a very nice, and it's about the campus.
This is when it was at the time when we were raising funds
Uh-huh.
for the campus. Oh yes, that was interesting that Jane Chernoff asked me to be in this film. She says, I think you would be a good, what shall we say, community grandfather.
Yep.
And would you come with me? We'd like to take a few pictures. I didn't know they were going to make a regular film out of this.
Beautiful.
I thought they were just going to take a few pictures for advertising for the campaign. So they asked me to take along my oldest grandchildren. That was Matt when he was about 5 years old, and Jamie was close to 4. And they were with me in the film, and I was telling them the story about Walnut Street and about our Jewish history. We were sitting on the stoop at the entrance of what is
Right.
now the Jewish Center.
Right, it's a
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
video.
Yes.
Other than your children and
Yes.
grandchildren, what are you most proud of in your life? What can you say, I am so proud that
I'm proud to be Jewish. I'm
Okay,
proud
but
of our
you're born
people.
Jewish.
But I'm proud of our people. I'm
Okay.
proud of all the wonderful things that our people have done. We're such a small minority, you know. We're only maybe 12 or 13 million now, but so many of our people were very creative. There were so many wonderful research people. Look at the Nobel Prizes.
Just
We
recently.
we have such a large percentage for the small percentage of our people, with doctors and lawyers and accountants and people in industry and business and inventors. And I understand that the Intel chip was invented in a factory in Israel, and the cell phone was invented in the Motorola factory in Israel. And there were so many things I didn't know about. And the first CAT scan was invented in Israel that was brought to the United States many, many years ago. There's so many things I don't even know about that, and just about it in Israel. But our people over the years were literally survivors, because we were bouncing around from so many countries, from one place to the other. And that explains, I think, why so many of our people became tradesmen, because they knew that sooner or later they had to pick up and run. And someone in the jewelry business, and someone in other business, because they had relatives that drifted in other countries, and that's how they developed and had relationships all around the world. That's how some of them became
So that-
bankers.
So that's what you're proudest of. Do you have any regrets in your life that you would care to mention on tape?
No,
Any regrets about our Jewish community? Any regrets?
No. I think we're doing everything right. Oh, we make mistakes. We're only human. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I think we've done the best we could. Our Jewish community is one of the finest communities in the country per capita. For our size, I understand that we raise more funds than most for our size per capita. And that's also true with JNF and other organizations. We have quite a nice community in Milwaukee as far as our Jewish people are concerned. And I'm so happy to see young people come up and are learning and doing and getting involved in various aspects of the community, whether it's Federation or JNF or Israel Bonds, and they're breaking records there too with Israel Bonds. And all the many organizations, whether it's the Zionist organization or Women's Art or Nyamat Pioneer Women, which they call it now, or all the Hadassah, all the many organizations. I can't even think of all of them. I'm proud of all the women, all the men, and all the young people.
Well, you have been a builder of this community for many years. And
sure.
As I say, through your campaign and your generosity and your leadership, everybody wants Joe on their committee and on their divisions, because you are the kind of person you are. I would think that's how you would like to be remembered. How would you like to be remembered?
Well, that sounds
You like
pretty. That sounds pretty good to me. That's
you
one.
like there.
That's
You like
that's
that.
wonderful. I made so many friends that it's hard to believe, and I literally have to count them in the thousands. Just visiting in Florida, for instance, I counted 100 people that I knew. That doesn't mean everybody's buddy with me, but I knew them. I knew them from back home. So when we go visit in Florida, I got lots of people to see, go to lunch, go to dinner, and do the other things that a lot of us like to do. And that's true all over. That's the wonderful thing about our people. No matter where you go in the world, we find out if you meet a Jewish person, you feel so comfortable because we're literally talking about Jewish geography and Jewish history. If you go to another shul in another city, another country, or wherever, you always feel good. I get that nice feeling.
Right.
That's why I'm proud of being Jewish, because I don't know anybody else, any other group of people that feel that way. They wonder, why do Jewish people seem to have that feeling? But I guess it's just inherent in us. We just feel good about discussing about these things because our common denominator over 4,000 or 5,000 years have been with us.
Right.
And
I don't want to end the tape without mentioning and having you spend a minute talking about your wife. And Ruthie died, and you were lucky to find another.
yes,
I'd like you to say something about
Yes,
her, who she
yes.
is, and
It
how
just-
you met.
just goes to show that when I say I feel lucky, even though I was born on a Friday 13, I survived the war. I never expected to come home because we had so many losses with the 82nd Airborne. And here I am pushing 83. I feel very, very lucky. And what had happened is I said to myself, I'm tired of looking at four walls. And I get up in the morning. And
After Ruthie died, you mean?
After Ruthie was gone, and I thought it would be nice to see some people that I could go to lunch with or dinner or maybe a concert, like Ruthie and I used to do. And I began to think of who I might ask amongst the widows that I know. And Harriet was actually the first one. I counted 10 women.
And her name was Harriet.
Her name at that time was Harriet Esser. And the interesting thing why it happened that way, why I had called her, was because we grew up in the same neighborhood, and I knew Ted, and she knew my Ruthie a little bit, because we used to see her when we went shopping at Boston's store in Marshall Field, because she was behind the counters selling different things. One time it was dishes, another time was jewelry. And I remembered that. She told me later that she retired in 1990, but this was 1998 that I called her up and said, you know, we know each other's families over the years, must be 50 years, and wouldn't it be nice to get together and go for coffee? Would you like to do that and talk about it? Because her kids grew up with my kids and went to Marshall together, and our grandchildren grew up together and went to the Jewish day school together. And everybody knew everybody. And it's interesting. I said, wouldn't you like to do that? And she told me she agreed to go there. So we went to Heinemann's for coffee. And she told me later on the reason she did that, after not going out with anybody for 16 years. She was very popular with friends and relatives. She was so popular, but refused to go out with a fellow or be fixed up. And she says the only reason she went with me, because in fact we did know each other's families.
That's so nice.
And we talked about it, and then it seemed to me that almost every week there was a reason for me to call her. I thought, gee, she was as nice as I remembered, and I wanted to call her. Why should I call anybody else? And I remember the Federation had an annual meeting, so I called her and said, you know, I'm tired of going to a lot of these dinners alone. Would you be my guest and go with me? And then one time the Children's Outing Society was honoring Steve and Joan Marcus at the Pfister, and they had a beautiful lunch, and I thought I would be a part of it. I was asked to, and my brother-in-law, Jack Weiner, was always involved in that. So I called her up and asked her if she would like to be my guest and go to that. And that's what happened with
So when did
almost
you get
every
married?
week. Well,
How long did your little courtship last?
this lasted a few months, and I felt so comfortable with her and taking dance lessons
Yeah.
and practicing at her house because she liked big band music too, like she knew Ruthie and I liked that. That one day after dancing, all of a sudden something hit me, and I looked at her like I'm looking at you, and it just popped out of me, and I said, Harriet, I think I'm falling for you.
Aw.
And she says, well, I feel pretty good too. And it was a couple months. We were going together now by a couple of months, and I said, you know what, I'm an old-fashioned guy. And she says, I'm an old-fashioned girl. So I said, you know what, we got to find a date to get married because we got serious.
So when was that?
And we decided the time to do it was when our families came together was Thanksgiving, because she had a family reunion. Her two boys in Madison and her other daughter out west would come into town with her daughter Susie in Milwaukee, because she had two daughters and two sons, and she always made Thanksgiving. So she had a family reunion. Well, my two daughters, Bunny and Amy, decided they were going to do our reunion and have Debbie come in from Minneapolis and do Thanksgiving since Ruthie was gone, and we would have our family. So we thought that would be the best time to get married. So I called up Rabbi Goldenholz, who knew us quite well. He knew both families. And of course, way back when, I had heard about him when I was vice president at Temple and helped bring him in because I was on search committee. And he knew the story of both our families. And when I told him about it, he said, Joe, I got tears in my eyes. This was over the telephone. He says, I know the story, so I'll do anything you want.
So
I
when
said,
was it?
so we decided to get married on Thanksgiving. He opened up the shul special so we could have the ceremony on the bima there, because our family had a lot to do with building the shul.
What year was it?
That was November 26, 1998.
Very nice.
Coming
So,
up next month will be 6 years.
Mazel tov, mazel tov.
It's hard to
That's
believe
nice.
the time ran by so quickly that Harriet and I say to each other once in a while that it's hard to believe it's like we knew each other all our
Well,
lives.
you really did,
And,
so.
yeah, in a
anyway,
sense we did.
And our time is up, and I want to thank you, Joe, for coming in and sharing your story with us. As I say, you've been a very important part of our community. You were, in fact, one of the early volunteers in the Jewish Historical Society when we used to call
Yes,
Milwaukee.
that's right, on Monday mornings.
That's right.
I
Milwaukee
remember,
Jewish Archives.
I
And
remember
now
I-
you can see this is a
I
product.
came down, yeah.
This is a product.
I came down for a while till I got
Yes.
busy on Mondays, even
Yes.
though I was retired.
Right.
I keep busy.
But anyway, we thank you for sharing your story and for being a supporter of the program and of the entire Jewish community. Thank you
Well,
so much.
Thank you so much for asking me.
My pleasure. I wouldn't not ask you.